Thank you very much. As you, or probably most of you, are quite familiar with, if we speak about brain connectivity, we typically distinguish 3 different types. The first one being structural connectivity, which is just the anatomical connections. Then functional connectivity, which is statistical interdependencies between both signal time series in distinct brain regions. And lastly, effective connectivity, which in contrast to functional connectivity really tries to infer upon directed influences among neuronal populations. And a very prominent tool that has been used rather frequently to study effective connectivity in the human brain is DCM, or dynamic causal modeling. And as I said, it has been used quite frequently in order to study the neuronal mechanisms that underlie various cognitive functions, both in health and disease, and has had some successes in doing so. But it's also subject to some fundamental limitations. And probably, to my mind, one of the most severe limitations of the model is that it's typically restricted to very small networks. That means you can only investigate networks that comprise 8 to 10 regions and not more. And the reason for that is that if you go beyond that, model inversion just becomes computationally infeasible. Now, that's not necessarily an issue if you have very precise hypotheses about specific neuronal circuits that you want to study, and you have experimental manipulations that address exactly those circuits. But for more exploratory analyses or more exploratory questions, such as what is underlying the pathophysiology of a psychiatric disorder, it might become a limitation to have small networks. And in such a situation, you might want to have a model that can actually infer whole brain effective connectivity, including potentially many more nodes than 10. And in order to at least move towards that goal, we have recently introduced regression DCM, which is kind of a novel variant of a DCM-like model. And I want to give you just a quick idea of what that model looks like before coming to some of the results. So we start off, for those of you who are familiar with DCM, with the classical formulation, but for regression DCM, we have to restrict ourselves to linear models. So that means we are only looking at the endogenous or fixed connectivity among brain regions and the driving inputs here depicted in red, which tell you how the experiment can directly perturb the activity in those network nodes. And what we now do is we use the Fourier transformation to bring that linear DCM from the time domain into the frequency domain, and by using additional simplifications and by using suitable priors, we can basically translate this linear DCM into a Bayesian linear regression-like model in the frequency domain. And don't be scared by those equations, they are more iconic, but what is important here is that such a Bayesian linear regression-like model is very efficiently to be inverted. So these typically lead to analytical update equations which are very efficient to solve and which may enable us to go to much larger network sizes. We have recently also augmented this approach further to also include sparsity constraints, and again, the formulas are just iconic. But what is important here is that because of these sparsity constraints, we can now basically start any regression DCM analysis by first looking at the fully connected network and then during model inversion automatically pruning this network to the most representative effective connectivity pattern that describes our data. Now, for this model, we have done various simulation studies in order to assess the face validity of our approach, and we have also applied our model to various empirical data sets. And I just want to give you a first quick example, which should show the practical utility of our regression DCM framework. And in particular, we could show that using the sparse regression DCM or the sparse effective connectivity patterns that we obtain from regression DCM in a small 6-region network model that modeled the visual system, we could distinguish almost perfectly between aphasic patients that had a stroke outside of that network and healthy controls. So that lends some predictive validity to our approach, in particular because if we compare the predictive accuracy of our model with more simple measures like functional connectivity in that network or the bolt activation patterns in those regions, we perform significantly better. But of course, it's not what I've been alluding to at the beginning of my talk, that is a whole brain model. So in the last part of my talk, what I want to do is I want to give you a first proof of principle that we can actually apply this regression DCM model to a whole brain network where we can then infer whole brain effective connectivity patterns. And to do that, we use data from an fMRI scanner from a single representative subject. And that subject participated in a hand movement paradigm. So he was seeing a visual cue that was blinking at a certain frequency, and the subject had to perform left hand movements in synchrony with that blinking. And what you can observe is the typical activation pattern that is associated with hand movements. So you find activation in the contralateral primary motor cortex, in the supplementary motor areas, and in the premotor cortex, as well as in the cerebellum. And we now use the automatic anatomical labeling atlas, the AAL, as a whole brain postulation scheme to basically extract 104 time series that were representative of the task and the bolt activation patterns associated with it. So these time series were now fed into our DCM analysis, which means we had a 104 region DCM model, which is an order of magnitude larger than what has previously been possible with DCMs. And also keep in mind that we typically, in an RDCM analysis, start from the fully connected network. That means at the beginning, we had more than 10,000 parameters to estimate and then to prune in order to come up with a sparse representation. And the result looks like this. So on the left, you see the A matrix, the endogenous connectivity matrix, which basically tells you the connection strength from one brain region to another brain region. And on the right, you see the driving inputs. So how the experimental manipulation activated or deactivated each of those 104 brain regions. And here you can see the same connectivity pattern, but just projected onto a whole brain volume. And I want to go through these results in a little bit more detail to show you that these activation or these connectivity patterns were actually biologically quite plausible. So the first thing that you should notice is that the matrix looks quite sparse, despite the fact that we started from a fully connected network, right? So these sparsity constraints actually pruned a lot of the connections to zero. And if we now look at the individual submodules or some of the submodules that we can identify in the connectivity pattern, we see that they are quite sensible. So for instance, we find strong driving inputs to motor-related regions, as well as regions in the parietal cortex and the postcentral gyrus. And we also found connections, interconnections within those regions. And this is, of course, very plausible given the motor component of our task, as well as the visual motor component of our task. We also find driving inputs into visual regions, so the cuneus, but also other occipital regions, and we found connections from those visual regions onto the motor network. So this again is in line with that idea of visual pacing of the hand movements that the subjects had to perform. And finally, we also found that there were strong driving inputs into frontal regions and backward connections from those frontal regions onto the motor network that I've been mentioning. And this is in line with the idea of top-down control in which the subjects needed to engage in order to adhere to the task of synchronizing their fist closings to the blinking. Now, of course, there were quite a lot of other connections which might not be as directly related to the task as I've pointed out now, but I hope that you see that at least like some of the submodules or the general structure of the connectivity pattern that we obtained is actually quite plausible. And of course, more work is needed in order to further validate this approach because it's just at the beginning yet. All right, so to conclude, let me just point out that we will make the code for this model publicly available soonish, within the next couple of months, and you will be able to find it in that Tapas software suite that our lab provides. So check it out if you're interested in it. And if you have further questions or like to discuss with me further details, then come by at my poster today or tomorrow. And with that, I would like to thank all my collaborators and the funding agencies, and of course you for your attention. Thank you very much.